So tonight we are pleased to welcome two wonderful guests. Tonight's author, she's a cultural critic and historian and writes about art, war, politics, and the places where these discourses intersect. Her writing has recently appeared in Hyperallergic, Perfect Strangers, and Narratively, among many other publications. She holds a master's from NYU in experimental humanities and a bachelor's in literature from UC Santa Cruz. Go Banana Slugs. Please welcome Lorissa Rinehart. And joining Lorissa to her left and your right is Dr. Joseph Coohill, aka Professor Buzzkill. Joseph Coohill is an expert on British and Irish history. He received his doctorate in modern history from Oxford, which I hear is a pretty good school. He's widely been published in his field and has taught at universities in Britain and the United States. A public speaker by vocation, he is also the producer and host of the wildly popular Professor Buzzkill History podcast. His current research project is the Churchill Legend in the United States from 1939 to the 21st century. And his website, please check it out, professorbuzzkill.com. Welcome, Dr. Joe Coohill.
Thank you. You read that very well. I wrote it specifically that way. Larissa, aren't we so lucky, Larissa, and everyone, to live in Santa Barbara because we have a bookstore like this? Yeah. Let's have a big round of applause for Coffee. There aren't many bookstores in the country anymore that are so chock full of great books. I'm a total snob, as Larissa knows, a horrible snob. And I was in the history section and just in awe at the quality of the books here. I mean, really very good, very recent stuff. Mm-hmm. So I hope that you'll take time not only to buy Larissa's book, but other people's book, and including some local authors. So listen, unlike the rest of you, I got an advanced reader's copy because I'm a member of the press. And so I was able to read it ahead of time, and I love it so much. But you know, one of the things I think is so interesting about the book is that, and the book in general, is that, you know, journalists are part of our everyday lives. We don't realize it, but we hear them every single day, and sometimes all day. And yet, when it comes to the history books being written, they're sort of moved to the sidelines.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things your book does is bring the journalists back into the field of play.
Yeah, and I think it's important for a number of reasons. One of it is because journalists really filter these stories for us, right?
Yeah.
Like we think about the stories coming out of Ukraine right now. These are reported on by incredibly brave and intrepid reporters, and we rely on them to tell us what is happening. But it's the stories of how they got these stories that are also so fascinating. And so Dickie just had an extraordinary life and was just incredible at finding the center of history and reporting on it in a way that was unique to her time, right? Like big picture reporting was sort of the ethos of the day, where people would, reporters would sort of take at face value what the generals and the heads of state were telling them, but Dickie really wanted to see it for herself on the ground.
And I think it's so important, and as you say, the subtitle of the book is Untold Story, and there have been some minor things written about her, but frankly, this is one of these people who deserve more fame and glory. So let's delve right in.
Okay.
Who was Dickie Chappelle, and why should we know about her?
So Dickie Chappelle was a combat reporter from World War II through the early period of the Vietnam War. So she was on Iwo Jima. She was the only woman on Okinawa. She was the first Western reporter embedded with the National Algerian Liberation Front. Mm-hmm. She marched with Castro's forces in Cuba. She was the first woman to jump with the 101st and 82nd Airborne. She also was the first journalist to jump with the South Vietnamese Airborne. She marched with the South Vietnamese Marines. Of course, she marched many times with the U.S. Marines, as well as being embedded with the Sea Swallows, who were a
We have a young reader in the background. Somewhat related.
Somewhat related. As well as the Sea Swallows, who were an anti-communist guerrilla army in the Mekong Delta during the Vietnam War. So she really had a unique perspective of the early period of the Cold War, which was, of course, incredibly pivotal, not only in Cold War history, but also in world history. And she had sort of a front row view to how these many conflicts shaped the larger geopolitical stage.
Well, I was so impressed in reading, certainly in the beginning of her young life. Well, first of all, she does all of this stuff very young, which
Yes.
is amazing,
Yes.
right? But also how she got into, how she was interested in aviation, how she then became very interested in journalism, and then especially interested in photojournalism. That story really is wonderful. Please tell it so I don't keep having it tell it myself. I want to tell it, but you're better at it.
Thank you. So when she was young, really in her teens, she developed a love of flying. But this was 1934, and her mother said, "You absolutely cannot fly in a plane. These are like death traps. You're not allowed." So instead of learning to fly, she graduated her high school at 16 as valedictorian and was one of only 3 women accepted to the MIT Aeronautic Engineering program. And this is in 1934. So she goes to MIT in Boston. She's from Sherwood, Wisconsin. Sort of out of the view of her mother, she eventually talks her way onto a plane and finally takes flight. And she is sort of addicted from then on out and flunks out of MIT shortly thereafter.
Almost on purpose.
Almost on purpose, probably on purpose. Moves home and finds a job with the Flying Circus, which was, of course, a popular sort of entertainment at that time. She takes part of her salary in flying lessons. She learns how to fly. She also develops romantic feelings for one of the pilots, as one does, and her parents summarily ship her off to, Florida to live with her grandparents, where she very quickly finds a job with another flying circus. And this is 1939 at this point. The U.S. is still in the Great Depression, and she's paid $15 a week. So you can't complain about that kind of salary. But she goes to help promote a sister flying circus show in Havana, and she's also gotten herself a job as a stringer for the New York Times, reporting on this air show. So she's doubling up. Well, the sort of star pilot in the Cuban air show dies. Like his plane crashes during the air show, and this is her. And she runs to the crash to get the story, and then runs to the phones to get it into the New York Times. And this is really her first real reporting assignment, and also her first brush with violence. And she handles herself with sort of uncanny composure that she then carries throughout her career, reporting on these various combat zones.
Now, how then does this initial interest with flying, these initial experiences with flying, how does that then develop into a more or less full-time career as a wartime journalist?
Well, so this is 1939. Very shortly thereafter, Hitler, marches into Poland. She gets a job, again reporting for the New York Times, on the F-3F Grumman airplane, which is like the top of the line airplane at the time. There wasn't an Air Force then; it was actually a Navy. Handled all the air warfare, and she was the first journalist to fly in one of these planes because there was only one with the seat cut out of it. So she files that story, and then after that is sort of wants to be in the center of the war, wants to report on the war because she understands that this is a historical moment, this is a turning point in the world. And first goes to report on Panama, where troops are training for the Pacific Ocean Theater, right, for the jungle warfare, and then eventually does find her way to Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
Now, you have to tell our Chaucerians the wonderful as in gripping stories of her time in Okinawa and Iwo Jima.
Yes, so she gets to Okinawa, or rather she gets to Iwo Jima sort of on a technicality. So in World War II, women were not allowed to be where there were not women already, which is sort of like a tautology. But what this means is that she had to be where there were nurses. And so she gets an assignment aboard a hospital ship, the USS Samaritan, and that is going to Iwo Jima, that is headed for Iwo Jima. And as she is almost arrived to the island, she sees this Japanese bomber come out of the sky and drop its bomb, right? Specifically targeting this hospital ship. It misses by feet, like the spray of the bomb washes over the deck. She decides, therefore, to climb to the top of the highest point of the ship in order to get the best photograph possible. And she does so. And the bomber is making his second pass, and just as he's about to fly over the Samaritan, you know, an anti-aircraft battleship fires its anti-aircraft guns at it, and it sort of turns tail and retreats. But so this is her entrance into war. Mm-hmm. But then directly after that, she experiences all of these soldiers being transported from the island onto the hospital ship, and gets a really, I would say, rare understanding of war, right? She sees what happens after battle. So much of our narrative of war involves sort of the drama of battle, not the sort of suffering of what happens later. And so she develops this really deep sense of empathy for fighting forces around the world that she's able to carry with her immediately. Like on Okinawa, she's also at field hospitals. She's not supposed to be there. She's a woman. There are no nurses on Okinawa. She has sort of talked her way there. But she very quickly recognizes in several of the patients a condition called combat fatigue then and PTSD now. And she was one of the few journalists to really write about this plague that was affecting millions of returning veterans.
She seems to talk her way into a lot of assignments.
Yes.
And that's not only very brave, she's choosing the most risky assignments. How do you think she was able to accomplish that with the higher-ups?
Well, I mean, she didn't. She sort of disregarded the higher-ups, as it were.
That's one way to do it. Yeah.
So, for instance, I'll skip forward a little bit. Like, she covered the secret war in Laos in 1961, and there were no higher-ups because war wasn't declared. Special forces were there. The CIA was just doing whatever they wanted to. And the colonel in charge asked her, you know, will you eat bats, right? Because if they're cut off from supply lines, you have to survive on what's in the jungle. And she said, yes, sir. And he's like, okay, go ahead. So, and then in the case of Algeria, right, she was the first Western journalist, and really the first journalist to be embedded with the Algerian Liberation Front. And she did it because no one else was willing to do it, and also no one else was really interested in doing it. The narrative at that time was that the Algerians didn't deserve nationhood, didn't deserve independence, and couldn't handle it if they got it. And her opinion was, actually, they are a nation, they are people, and all people are entitled to self-determination.
Well, you know, it's amazing as you read through the book. First of all, there's the World War II stuff in the Pacific. There's Hungary in the 50s. There's Algeria. There's Castro in Cuba. She seems to be everywhere there's something major breaking in the Cold War.
She is, and she's able to do that, and I wish I could talk more about it in my book, so you get a sneak peek. She was able to do that because she spent a lot of time actually covering troops as they were training, covering the special forces, the 101st and 82nd Airborne, the Marines, the Army, et cetera, and she went on maneuvers with them, right? She went on their training exercises. And while she was on their training exercises, they would just chat with her and tell her where they were going next and what they planned to do. And so she found out that troops were in Laos in 1959. And we didn't discover, as Americans, that we were in Laos in 1959 until 2007. So from her close relationships with military personnel, both in the U.S. and around the world, she was invited many places. And I actually want to tell one more story. She was invited to cover Cuba by her butcher. So she, her butcher in Murray Hill in New York City, which is sort of near the Lower East Side, was Cuban, and she had known them for years. And he showed up to her door with her order, with his bloody smock on, and he said, "Why aren't you in Cuba?" And she said, "I don't know anybody." And he said, "Well, go to Bab's Diner tomorrow at noon, sit at the third booth from the left, and someone will meet you. And
Sounds like a
someone,
CIA
yes,
operation.
yeah. But it was, it was kind of
Yeah.
until it wasn't, and then it was. But she was handed a envelope, and her lunch was paid for, and soon thereafter she was on a plane to Havana.
It's astounding.
Yeah.
So let's then take it up into Vietnam, because it is Vietnam, I suppose, that is the bulk of the book. And what's so interesting is, as those of you may or may not know, she dies in 1965. So we're talking about the early part when, as you say, lots of Americans are still, Vietnam is sort of this little thing going on and rarely mentioned in the news. But she sees what's actually going on.
She sees what's going on, and she goes to Saigon in 1961. Like, she was a lot of places in 1961. But she goes there, and the Marine Commandant has actually asked her to write a briefing on guerrilla warfare, because at this point she has been reporting on guerrilla warfare for the better part of 10 years. She is an expert, more than almost anyone else. So she goes to Saigon, and she's holed up in her apartment writing this. She hasn't even gone into the field yet, but she's friends with all these special forces who are there. And she goes out to dinner, she asks them what's going on, and she very quickly understands, just from what they're telling her, that America is losing the war and will continue to lose the war if they don't change their tactics, right? Because the Viet Cong were fighting a guerrilla war, and America was fighting a conventional war. Well, the Viet Cong used to be the Viet Minh, and they just beat the French fighting conventional war. And so she, after being in Saigon, she then spends a lot of time in the field. She patrols the Ho Chi Minh Trail with the South Vietnamese Marines, and all the forces are South Vietnamese, right? Because the Americans aren't there yet, except for the MAG advisors. She's with the Navy. She is with the infantry on helicopters. And like I said, she was with the Sea Swallows, which were a self-organized guerrilla army. And she finds her original hypothesis that America was losing the war is true. And it is endemic to all of the branches of the military there.
And again, this is early.
Yeah.
Early. This is way before Vietnam is on the nightly news every night.
Yes, absolutely. And she also understands that it's a turning point sort of in the Cold War, and also a turning point for the people of Southeast Asia. Because, Vietnam is sort of coming under communist siege. Cambodia is under communist siege. Bordering them is Laos. And then also you have Thailand. So you have this enormous population under threat of communist dictatorship. And she, at this point, I also want to touch on this, that she has an incredible sense of not only empathy, but sympathy. And just to sort of backtrack a little bit, she was actually imprisoned in a communist jail and she was held in solitary confinement for 6 weeks.
This is in Hungary.
This is in Hungary. This is 1956, 57. And so she really understands what it is to live under a dictatorship in a way that most Americans, like white Americans, don't and can't. And so she had this incredible sense of allyship with folks regardless of their geography or religion or race, because she knew that everyone had to combat this threat together if they were to truly win the world for freedom.
That brings me to what I'd like to talk about before we talk about what ultimately happens to her in Vietnam, and that is the difference between what you say, how she's perceiving the American forces operationally, and how she's perceiving the North Vietnamese forces operationally. And part of the guerrilla warfare of the North Vietnamese was also, one of their strategies was also to help the locals out. And she just thinks the Americans should adopt that. And she says compassion should be an infantry tactic.
Yes.
I was gripped by that sentence and by that sentiment.
Yes. So she actually reported on the, in addition to everything else, she reported on the Civil War in the Dominican Republic. And she saw there that the 82nd Airborne was very involved with the community. And also she knew that other folks, other armies, other fighting forces got involved with the community. But this was inspired particularly by the 82nd Airborne. And she wrote a letter again to the military, or to the Marines Commandant, advising to use friendship as an infantry tactic, because she knew that in order to truly win the war, I'll rephrase this. A war is waged for peace, and the peace that you determine at the beginning determines the peace at the end. And if you do not have a sense of allyship and community when you begin, the peace will necessarily not be as fruitful as it could be. And in fact, it could lead to what happened after World War I, right? This World War II. So she really wanted the American advisors who were there to go and live with the South Vietnamese people, to eat what they ate, to learn their language, instead of staying cordoned off in Saigon as they were at the time.
And why did that sentiment, that idea, not bubble up better through the American high command, if you will?
So, another proponent of this was Ed Lansdale, who was, people think that The Quiet American was written about him. It didn't happen to be, but this is sort of like the figure that he was. I think it didn't bubble up for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was another thing that she cautioned against, which was the reliance of Americans on machines to win their war, right? If we think of really the introduction of machinery into warfare, of course we think of World War II, World War I, but then also the Vietnam War, right? This is the sort of chemicalization of war and the helicopterization of war. And I think more than any other war than in the past, we relied on superior technology. And she said very early on, machines don't win wars, men do. And I think this ethos of, we don't need to sacrifice anything to win. Of course we sacrifice a great deal, but we can win with our superior technology was sort of the philosophy of the day. And her own, and Ed Lansdale and other people's suggestion that actually peace is a more complex entity than that, did not get through the sort of emergent military-industrial complex.
Okay, now before we get on to you researching and writing the book, let's wrap up her story by telling what happened to her, because I think the details of what happened to her ultimately show how really she was first to the front, because she's right there in a situation that you can't be closer to the front than where she is and what happens.
Yes, so in March of 1965, the U.S. deploys the first combat Marines to Vietnam. She follows soon thereafter in October of 1965. And she is with some of the first Marines on a search and clear patrol in Chu Lai, which is just south of Da Nang, and Da Nang is of course right near the border of North and South Vietnam. And so the night before, she was out to dinner with a good friend of hers, and she said to him, when I die, I want to be on patrol with the Marines. So the very next day, she goes to Chu Lai. They go on patrol in the morning, and the young Marine in front of her steps on an improvised explosive device. She is next in line, and she is the one who bears the brunt of the explosion. She is lacerated in multiple places, and because they're just a few steps out of camp, the chaplain rushes forward to sort of hear her last words, and she says, it was bound to happen. And so I get chills every time I say that, because she was in combat for 20 years. She was in combat more than she wasn't, and no one survives that long in war. Just no one does. And she spent her life trying to communicate the bravery of those fighting for freedom, and she died the same way. And so it is both a tragic and a fitting end to her life.
And I think that's one of the reasons why her funeral was really sort of treated as a military funeral.
Absolutely. Yeah, she was given a full military honor guard.
Yeah.
Taps, the folding of the flag, everything. And she was actually made they still remember her. The Marines still remember her. She was made an honorary Marine in 2020, actually.
Well, now, tell us, first of all, how you discovered her story, how you discovered that more needed to be told about her, and then about the research that you did. And don't leave out any Indiana Jones like discoveries, you know, where you have to run.
Yeah, well, I was in
from
Angkor
bad
Wat.
guys.
I was in Angkor Wat, and her archives were actually in a cave, and I had no.
Right. Wait a minute.
However, it is an interesting story. So I actually heard about her in high school, and I worked at Cafe Roma, and for those long-time Santa Barbarians, you might remember, and you know, every Sunday I would take my tip money and I would go down to Just Play Music, and I would buy a CD. And one Sunday I bought A Clock Without Hands by Nancy Griffith, who is just a lovely Americana folk singer. And on this album is the song A Pearl's Eye View. And it's about Dickie Chappelle and how she would jump out of planes and march through the jungle and do whatever it took to get the story. And
all the time wearing pearl earrings.
all the time
That's
wearing pearl
why-
earrings.
That's where that comes
Yes,
from. Right.
exactly. And she just became a folk hero of mine, right? Because I would listen to the song all the time, and I wanted to be a writer, and I had a real passion for social justice. So she was my ideal. And then sort of life took me on the twists and turns that it does, and I was a waitress, as so many writers are. But then I was a restaurant manager, and then an arts curator. And then in 2016, what happened, and the election. And I kind of realized that if you have a dream, if you have a goal, you have to pursue it, or I have to pursue it, or else it's never going to happen. Life is finite, and the world is a volatile place. And so I quit my job, I went back to graduate school, and I wrote my thesis on the audio letters that Vietnam GIs would record and send home, and those that their families would send back to them. And of course, Dickie's name came up, and I hadn't thought of her in years. And so I sort of just started looking into her casually, but then I couldn't find anything, on Google or the internet, as it were. And so then I started looking into the, myriad of databases that I had available, right? Like, all digitized knowledge was at my fingertips. Well, she wasn't there either. So then this is the Indiana Jones part.
Yeah.
The only place that I could find the majority of her work was in a public library on microfilm. And I think everyone's familiar with microfilm, but if you're not, it's that miniaturized text on a long roll of film, and you put it in the machine, and you put your face in the machine, and you scroll through 1,000 miles, and then you find it.
Yeah.
And so I was in the basement of this library reading about her on the border of Turkey and the USSR on New Year's Eve 1957, and jumping out of helicopters in, South Vietnam, and reporting on World War II. And I just couldn't believe that these works, which were in Reader's Digest, National Geographic, the National Review, big publications.
She's not some marginal reporter.
No, yeah, she
writing
was like
for the news press or anything.
Exactly. So,
Like the news press.
so I just couldn't believe that these were not more widely available, and that not more had been written about her as well. And so that's when I decided that I had to write a book. And in order to do this, her archives are held at the Wisconsin State Historical Archives, which is a wonderful institution. And I just read everything she wrote. Sort of everything that was there, I read it. And I went through her photographs, and I just tried to immerse myself in her story and her voice and her perspective, because I wanted this book, it is my voice, but I really wanted her voice to come through. So there are very long quotations of her writing in this book. And then in addition, her favorite genre was sort of these noir thrillers, right? She would just have a pack of cigarettes and a quart of buttermilk and read all weekend, these dime store thrillers. And so I wanted this to have the sense of adventure, because her life was so adventurous.
Well, and it definitely does have that. And what I wanted to stress about this part of our discussion is that, not everything's on the internet. you have,
Yeah.
historians especially have to go to the archives, and yes, you have to bring your Indiana Jones whip and all that other stuff to get the stuff, but, you know, there's so much stuff out there that really needs quality digging.
Yes.
And there's no more quality digging done in recent books, I think, than Lorissa has done in this one.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much for writing it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming here, and I suppose we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Is that Chaucer's allowing it?
Yes.
Bruce in the back.
So, besides the research, which sounds daunting, what was the hardest part of writing the book?
I wrote this book when I had one young child who was just born, and I'm grateful that I had my mom and my wonderful husband and my stepdad and my aunt to support me. But being a mom, like, to be frank, you know, I wrote in the daytime and then I would edit on my phone while I was breastfeeding at night. Like, that was pretty tough, just the writing of the book with a child. And then as I was going in to deliver my second child, my editor sent me my last edits. So I had a small child and then I was pregnant in writing this book. And it was both an inspiration to write this book because I think it is a prescient book. I think her voice is important to this world, and I want this world to be a wonderful place for my children. But it was also physically taxing to write this book. I think my next one will be easier.
Who else has a question? There must be plenty.
Do you think she was ignored because she was female?
Yes, I do. I think she was, you know, a journalist, like a lot of women, their best advocate, they are their. Okay, Stevie, I'll be right there.
I hope that goes on YouTube.
It's
Priceless.
it's good.
Duty calls.
Yeah. So she was ignored because she was a woman, but women are often their own best advocates when they are alive. So she really did have a public presence and a following when she was alive, but as soon as she died, she didn't have an advocate.
Duty screams.
Yes, indeed. Perhaps we could take a break outside, Dad.
That was baby talk for when does the paperback version come out?
Yes. So, in any case, and I also think she was ignored because she was a freelance journalist and she didn't have like a machine behind her, right? Like, if you write for the New York Times. Mommy, stop it! She didn't have this machine behind her, but she was freelance because she was a woman. So it kind of all comes back to, you know, being a female.
I think we have time.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you talked a lot about her journalism and this sort of thing. I'm interested in knowing, did she have any impact? Because photography was a big part of her reporting.
Yes.
Did she change like journalism photography at all, or photography in general, or anything like that?
So that's a really great question, Stephen, and I don't talk about it much in my book because there's only so much time, but she did, and she did because she had a real gift for the snapshot, a real gift for taking that photo that maybe wasn't perfectly composed but had an authenticity to it that was more moving, perhaps. And I think we see a lot of that influence today in modern combat photojournalism.
We have time for one or two more?
Did she seek to reveal all that she knew about what we were keeping secret? Was there tension between her and some of the higher ups?
So that's a really great question, and the answer is yes and no. So she took the first photograph of a Marine in combat in Vietnam, and this was in 1963, before we committed combat Marines aboard, and he was aboard a helicopter. And the military tried to censor this photograph, and it was for an article in National Geographic. And she really went to the mattresses, as did National Geographic, to get this photograph in. And eventually the higher ups had to relent. On the other side, you know, when she was in Laos, she also saw special forces in combat, which would have very much upset the detente between the United States and the Soviets at the time. And she submitted her article to military censorship. And they wrote, and I know this because she kept the draft, they wrote, "The story has to jibe, please rewrite," which she did. But then she submitted her photographs also to censorship in the Army, and somehow they lost all of her photographs. And then they also printed one of her photographs in an Army journal that she obviously read and was very upset. And it was really at that point that she stopped trusting the military to like censor only what was in the best national security interest rather than their own interests. And she was very concerned with the increased involvement of the CIA in the Cold War and was vocal about the dangers of that.
One final wrap-up question.
Oh, yeah. So I was so moved by the story of Vicky and her championing the Hungarian Revolution and literally reaching across that border and helping people come to freedom. Can you talk a little bit about the price she paid for that and how she interacted with her captors?
Yeah, so she was so in addition to wanting to be embedded with the Hungarian freedom fighters, she helped refugees across the border, and she would cross the border every night with a number of other journalists, including James Michener, who became a close friend of hers. But she was imprisoned, and in terms of how she interacted with her captors, she tried to have empathy for everyone. She tried to understand what motivated people, especially when that motivation was fear. And so she wrote an article for, I want to say, the Sunday Evening Post called "Nobody Owes Me a Christmas." And on Christmas Day, she was afforded an extra piece of bacon in her cell. And she wrote about how even in this frozen hell that there was a sense of mercy. And that Americans should remember that even though we're fighting against this evil empire, it is full of people who are not necessarily evil.
Well, that's a great sentiment for us to end on, and just to say thank you, Lorissa, for coming to Chaucer's, again, the most wonderful bookstore in creation. And thank all of you for coming, and now it's time to get some books and get them signed. So I'm going to do